All right, thank you, Chris. So today I'm going to be covering an introduction to tree physiology. And I just wanted to start with a little background. So I work for University of Illinois Extension Forestry. I coordinate the Southern Illinois Beginning Forest Landowner Program. And if you want to learn more about that, you can find information on the Illinois Extension Forestry website. There's my contact information if you want to get a hold of me after the presentation. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Forestry from Southern Illinois University Carbondale, and I am currently working towards my Master's of Science in Forestry at SIU as well. I have a variety of experience when it comes to forestry, so tree ID, invasives, etc. But tree physiology is something that I have a lot of interest in. So today we're going to look at just a few areas of tree physiology. We'll cover the basic tree structure and function, water movement in a tree, and how trees deal with wounds. I will note that this presentation will focus mostly on temperate trees, so not tropical trees. Tropical trees have much of the same physiology, but their growth is a little different. And much of this will be specific to angiosperms, so hardwood trees, not gymnosperms, so not, there might be some overlap like talking about conifers, but it's mostly going to be specific to hardwoods. And this is just for the sake of time because most of our trees here in Illinois fall into that hardwood or angiosperm group. And tree physiology is quite extensive, so I can't possibly cover it all in this time frame, but be on the lookout for more tree physiology talks in the future. So we'll start with basic tree structure and function. So first, I'm going to just kind of define what a tree is. So one definition from Alex Shigo, who is a plant pathologist, is that they are long-lived woody perennials that compartmentalize. And we'll talk about that term compartmentalize here in a little bit. Another definition from Merriam-Webster is that a woody perennial plant, trees are a woody perennial plant having a single, usually elongate main stem, generally with few or no branches on its lower part. So there's a lot of different definitions out there for a tree, but there are some specific aspects that they all have in common. So all trees are perennial, so they live several years. They have primary and secondary growth. So not only do they grow upwards and outwards, but they put on diameter growth, which is that secondary growth. They have woody tissue, so the cells of the main structure of the tree are hard or tough, and that's due to lignin and cellulose within the cells. They compartmentalize, so this is kind of how they wall off a wound, and we're going to talk about that more in detail in a little bit. And then they also shed parts. So they shed the foliage or the leaves, the bark, branches, roots, flowers, and fruits. So what is tree physiology then? So this is basically the study of how trees grow and behave or function in relation to genetics and their environment. So we're just gonna take a look at the overall structure of a tree. So we have the canopy and crown, the trunk or main stem of the tree, and the root system. The canopy and crown performs photosynthesis. It allows for the transportation of nutrients, water, and sugars through the leaves and branches. This is part of the vascular system of the tree. It allows for transpiration to occur, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Chemicals and hormones can be produced in the canopy and crown, and respiration also occurs here. The trunk or main stem of the tree is kind of a highway, allowing for the transportation of nutrients, water, and sugars, also part of that vascular system. It also provides stability and structure. It provides storage of sugars over winter and throughout the year, and also performs respiration as well. And then finally, the root system provides stability, water and nutrient uptake from the soil. It produces chemicals and hormones and performs respiration, and also is a place of storage. So now I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail with those different parts of the tree, starting with the canopy, and specifically we're going to look at leaves. So this is a rough depiction of the different parts of a leaf, and I'm briefly going to discuss what they are and their function. So starting with the cuticle, upper epidermis, and lower epidermis, their essential role is for protection of the leaf, kind of like skin. It prevents water loss and prevents foreign matter from entering the leaf. Then we have the palisade and spongy cells within the leaf. The main role for these is to perform photosynthesis. This is where chlorophyll exists, which is that green pigment that allows for photosynthesis to occur. Palisade cells tend to have more chlorophyll because it's on the upper portion of the leaf, but both perform photosynthesis. And then we have veins that run throughout the leaf. So this is the zone where water, nutrients, and the sugars produced during photosynthesis, as well as other products produced by the tree, are channeled through the leaf to the stem and vice versa. And then we have guard cells and stomata. So the guard cells are collections of two cells which can become turgid or flaccid to open or close a small space in the leaf surface, which allows for gas exchange. And that small space is the stomata. So we all probably learned about photosynthesis in school at some point. We learned that leaves of plants use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose or sugar and oxygen. The oxygen is released and the sugar remains in the tree as a source of food, essentially. And photosynthesis can occur in green stems, flowers, and fruits as well, but it's mostly seasonal, with the majority occurring during the growing season and occurs during the day only. Another process you may not have heard of is respiration. It's basically the reverse of photosynthesis. So the tree takes that sugar that it produced during photosynthesis, along with oxygen that is absorbed from outside the tree, and through a reaction creates carbon dioxide, water, and usable energy for maintenance and growth. It can also use this energy for absorption of mineral nutrients and translocation of materials in the tree. So this process results in manufacturing of complex carbs, lipids, amino acids, proteins, and defense chemicals, as well as chemical building blocks for the cells for every living part of the tree. And this process of respiration occurs all year long and in all living cells within the tree. And it occurs during the day and during the night. So the sugars that aren't used like right away for respiration are stored within the tree, in the trunk and the roots for use later. So during the day, the tree is photosynthesizing and respiring, and during the night, it's only respiring. So it's important for the health of the tree that the rate of photosynthesis is greater than the rate of respiration, so enough sugar can be produced to support the demand of respiration, even in the dormant season. This is usually not a problem for a healthy tree, but landowners or land managers should be mindful of this and refrain from damaging that photosynthetic material. So thinking of like pruning at the right time of year, preventing damage, which can allow fungus or insects to invade, and things like that should be considered. So moving on to the shoots and stems. So here we have a cross section of a trunk or main stem of a tree. A major role of this part of the tree is acting as part of the vascular system. So I'm just going to go through some of the major layers of that system here. So starting with the heartwood. This is the innermost wood in a tree composed of dead cells. It was once part of the sapwood, which is just outside of that heartwood. It often has a much darker color than the outer sapwood, and the color is due to different extractives in the tree, such as tannins, gums, resins, and polyphenols that are deposited there in the heartwood. And rates of deposition and types of extractives deposited in the heartwood differ among different species and genera. Also, some trees do not have true heartwood. There is what is known as false heartwood that may give a discolored look, typically due to a wound-induced discoloration or decay. Sugar maples do not have true heartwood, for instance, but have been known to form false heartwood, or dark heart is another name for that. And it's typically a result of fungal infection and can eventually lead to heart rot. So moving on, just outside the heartwood is the sapwood. So this area conducts sap, mostly water, some nutrients and sugars. It strengthens the stem, provides support, and acts as a storage reservoir for starch or sugars over the winter. On average, only about 10% of the sapwood cells are alive and are in the outermost area of the sapwood. Sapwood moves up and down the stem, moves sap up and down the stem from the buds and the tips of the branches to the tips of the roots, and moves products inward and outward through small tube-like structures called vessels. Heartwood and sapwood together make up what is known as the xylem. And just outside the sapwood is our next layer, the vascular cambium. So it's a very thin layer, only a few cells wide, where new xylem and new phloem, or the inner bark, is developed. This is where we see secondary growth occurring, putting on the diameter of the tree. And then just outside of that vascular cambium is the phloem, also known as the inner bark. The zone moves photosynthate, or the sugar produced during photosynthesis in the crown, down through the tree to the roots and into the sapwood to store over winter. Between the sapwood, vascular cambium, and phloem are these plates of cells that extend from the phloem to the heartwood and move materials back and forth through the vascular system. These are known as rays. So water can be moved from the xylem out to the phloem to move sugars down the tree, and sugars can be brought in from the phloem to the xylem to store over winter in the water for next year's growth, moving through these rays. Just outside of the phloem, or the inner bark, is the cork cambium. So this thin layer develops new layers of just that outer bark. And then finally, the outer bark, also known as the periderm, is composed of dead cells. It is plugged with suberin and waxes, which prevent water loss. It protects from insects, bacteria, and other unwanted pests. And it consistently sheds outer layers, and new layers are developed from within in that cork cambium. So here's just kind of a cool microscopic visual cross-section of that vascular system. So we can see here is the xylem. So that's the heartwood and the sapwood there. This is the area with the phloem. We have the vascular cambium right between those two, just a very thin layer. And then we have the cork cambium right outside the phloem, another very thin layer of cells. And finally, the cork, or that outer bark. Next, we'll move on to roots. So roots do a lot of things for the tree. They absorb water and nutrients, also transport those water and nutrients. They support and anchor the tree. They can store those starches or sugars. They produce secondary metabolites, so like hormones or allelochemicals. And they also host fungi and other microorganisms. There's a few types of roots that can be found on trees. So we have perennial roots. These are the larger roots. They transport water and nutrients up the tree. They support and anchor the tree and also provide areas for storage. Then we also have ephemeral or non-woody roots. So these roots will shed over time and regrow. They absorb water and nutrients. They host mycorrhizal fungi. And in the absence of resources, like I said, they'll shed off. And where resources are available, they'll grow new ephemeral roots. Some trees also have what are known as striker roots. So these are kind of like vertical roots that grow down. And this is common in drier soils. They can form kind of a second layer of roots deeper in the soil for storage or to access more resources. And then sometimes around the root collar of the tree, usually due to injury or a buried root collar, you can also have adventitious roots. So there are many photos that kind of give the impression that a tree, that the roots are a mirror image of the crown, but that's not actually the case. The root system is for the most part quite shallow and within the soil. It's only within those upper 12 inches of the soil typically, and it extends well past the crown unless it's restricted for some reason. A common analogy is to think of a wine glass on a dinner plate. So now we'll move on to water movement in a tree. So in trees, water does a variety of things. It acts as a solvent. It's a means of transport for those nutrients and other solids. It can act as a coolant for the tree. It's an ingredient in photosynthesis, and 80 to 90% of the weight of growing tissues in the tree is made up of water. So the main entry point of water in a tree is through the roots. It's absorbed through those young, non-hardened roots, the ephemeral roots, within the upper 12 inches of the soil. And the main exit point is through the leaves via a process called transpiration. So I've often received questions about how water moves in a tree. There are a few factors that influence this. So this is my oversimplified explanation of water movement in a tree. It's a little bit of physics, but I'll do my best to keep it simple. So the movement of water in a tree largely has to do with water potential, and it's mostly a passive system. So water potential is essentially the difference between potential energy between any given water sample and pure water. It is measured in megapascals, which is a unit of pressure, and there are multiple factors that can influence this, with some of the major influences in a tree being solute concentration, turgor pressure in the cells, and the opening and closing of the stomata on the leaf. What is important to understand is water moves from high water potential to low water potential. Pure water has a potential of 0, but with the addition of dissolved solids, it develops a negative potential or a lower potential. So as pressure becomes more negative as well, resulting in a tension in the cells of the tree, water potential also becomes lower. The main process that facilitates the absorption of water into the tree roots is a result of differences in solute concentrations within the roots of the tree and the soil and water surrounding the roots. So the difference in solute concentrations between the two causes water to move from the soil into the roots. This is also known as osmosis. Tree roots need the water that is present in the soil to have less dissolved solids or a higher water potential than is present in the roots in order to uptake that water. And in natural settings, this is normally not a problem. Trees do have some ability to manipulate the water potential in their roots by adding or removing solute molecules within the cells, but only to a certain extent. So this can be an important consideration, for instance, in like urban or planted tree settings. So think about like salting roads or fertilizing your trees. When you have that salt or the fertilizer addition to the soil, you're lowering the water potential in the soil. We can't really avoid salting our roads, but that salt can have negative effects on trees, especially with poorly developed root systems. But avoiding fertilizing during a drought, for instance, is a good takeaway from this. Fertilizing during a drought can really increase the concentrations of dissolved solids in the soil water and make it difficult for the tree to absorb that water. It's better to fertilize in the spring when there is more moisture in the soil, so you aren't making it more difficult for the tree to pull water from the soil. As far as water moving up the tree after entering the roots, this is largely driven by water potential differences and the high cohesive and adhesive forces of water. So transpiration, or the process of water leaving the tree through the stomata in the leaves, creates a negative pressure, which pulls water and those dissolved solids that are in the water up from the roots to the top of the tree through the xylem, or the sapwood specifically that we discussed earlier. It's kind of like a vacuum, or like when you suck on a straw. The high cohesive and adhesive forces of water add to this as well. So water molecules stick to each other and to other molecules very well. And I made this rough sketch here on the right of a water potential gradient, which shows water potential becoming more negative or lower as you move up the tree from the roots to the atmosphere. The atmosphere's water potential will fluctuate with temperature, humidity, but it's that overall gradient from higher to lower that is contributing largely to water movement in combination with the high cohesive and adhesive forces that water has. So the main exit point of water in a tree is through the leaves in a process called transpiration. Essentially, water evaporates through small openings on the surface of the leaf called stomata. Most have these on the underside of the leaves, but some have it on the under and upper sides of the leaves, like willow and cottonwoods. This is more typical of trees that grow near bodies of water where there's plenty of water available. So the stomata are those openings on the leaf which allow for CO2 to enter and oxygen to escape during photosynthesis. They also allow excess water to be released in the form of water vapor. Transpiration rates can change depending on several factors such as temperature, relative humidity, and wind, as well as the adaptations of each individual tree and the process that drives the movement of water from the stomata surfaces is diffusion, or in this case, the movement of water from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. The leaf's water vapor content is pretty close to saturation usually, so the air outside the leaf has a lower concentration and therefore water is driven outward. So around 90% of the water moving through a tree is used for transportation of nutrients and other solutes, cooling off the tree's temperature, kind of in the same way we sweat to cool off our body, and maintaining turgor pressure, or essentially preventing the cells in the tree from becoming flaccid. And then 10% or less is used for chemical reactions like photosynthesis. And I thought this was kind of a cool fact. According to the USGS, a large oak can transpire on average 40,000 gallons of water in a year. So the stomata, as I mentioned, are surrounded by guard cells. These control the opening and closing of the stomata. When plenty of water is available inside the tree, these guard cells are turgid, and so that enables them to remain open. But in situations where water is not abundant, like in a drought situation, the guard cells become flaccid and they close the stomata to conserve water. Light also triggers the guard cells to open to allow for gas exchange for photosynthesis. So finally, we'll move on to how trees deal with wounds. And here are just some fun wound pictures that I've taken. So there's a wound here just on the side of the tree, maybe from a lawnmower or something bumping it. A big wound here at the base of a tree. Um, this is a wound from a girdle that did not result in killing the tree because it was just a single girdle. It's actively um, dealing with that wound and still a living tree. And then this was kind of an odd wound I found. I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but I guess this whole kind of section of bark somehow peeled off and the tree is trying to deal with that wound there. So the way trees deal with wounds is through a process called compartmentalization of decay, and they don't heal like we do. They kind of wall off the area of a wound to prevent disease from spreading. So Alex Shigo, a plant pathologist, kind of coined this term, compartmentalization of decay in trees, or CODIT. And he has a lot of great articles out there to kind of explain this process. But this is done through the development of 4 walls in the tree. So walls 1 through 3 are the reaction zone that kind of react to the wound pretty immediately. And then wall 4 is the barrier zone, which develops a type of wood that we call callus wood. So at the time of injury, the tree produces 3 walls. Wall 1 will resist the vertical spread of infected wood and is the result of cells being plugged up, in a sense, above and below the wound. So you can see there below the wound, I have that number 1, so it's there below, and then it would be above as well. Wall 2 resists the inward spread from utilizing the annual growth ring, which is just inside of the wound area as a boundary. So here's wall 2. And then wall 3 resists the lateral spread as a result of those rays around the wound, which are thickened. So you can see wall 3 indicated here. Later, the vascular cambium, that layer that is just outside the sapwood, will generate wall 4, which separates the infected wood from newly forming healthy wood. That 4th wall is continuously added to as the tree puts on more growth each year until the wound is completely grown over and what we call compartmentalized. So the amount of time it takes to do this will vary depending on the size of the wound and the health of the tree, but essentially it's creating a completely walled off compartment where that wound will stay there, but it won't be able to spread throughout the tree. So sometimes we make intentional wounds, like when pruning. When doing so, it's best to keep it small so the tree does not have to exert as much energy towards developing that 4th wall. You can see the 4th wall developing here. It's that light gray bark on the left photo and the kind of orange brown bark on the right. That's what we call the callus wood. It can take several years to fully compartmentalize these wounds. Here you can see some wounds that were successfully compartmentalized in this ash tree cookie. So number 1 there I have labeled is a wound from a branch. There's that kind of smoothed out area behind the wound, which indicates to me that it's a wound from a branch. You'll see that kind of smoothed bark. It's kind of a result of the branch union wood, which grows a little differently. And it was either pruned off naturally or by a human. That's unclear, but successfully compartmentalized that. And then number 2 and 3 are wounds from something else, like fungus or some disease. There are multiple rings of healthy sapwood outside all of these wounds, and the decay is pretty minimal overall because of those 4 walls. So it did a pretty good job of successfully preventing the spread of any disease. So just a few more considerations when it comes to wounds. There's no need to fill in a wound. You're not doing the tree any favors by doing this. You're actually making it more difficult for the tree to compartmentalize this because it now has to grow around this foreign material. Also, if the tree does successfully grow around this, someone in the future with a chainsaw may have a very unpleasant surprise. So there's also no need to paint over a wound. Sometimes there's special cases where you may be recommended to paint over a wound. For instance, if you're pruning oaks during the growing season, especially red oaks, because they're susceptible to oak wilt. But it would be best if you would just avoid pruning during this time and prune during the dormant season to avoid any of that issue. Here's kind of a cool example of a wound that I found. This is a sugar maple. and this is a purposefully induced wound in a syruping operation. So if you're unaware, producing maple syrup in a true maple syruping situation requires putting small taps into a maple tree each year to collect the sap that's present in that sapwood. Each year, this tree likely only had 1 or 2 taps if they were following best management practices or best tapping practices, I guess. So it's been tapped for several years. A best practice for maple tapping is to move each year's tap over horizontally a couple inches. So by doing this, you access an active area of sap flow that hasn't been walled off during coated. And it should also allow enough time to pass that by the time you get around the tree again, there will be new healthy sapwood outside that old tapped area. And you can see outside of all these tapped areas, there's that lighter colored sapwood where the tree has successfully compartmentalized the wood and was able to continue growing outside that area. So I kind of wanted to wrap up with a few management considerations based on what we've covered today. So number one, don't harm the photosynthetic material if you don't have to. This is a concern, especially, well, mainly during the growing season. Remember, we discussed that respiration occurs 24/7 and 365 days a year, but photosynthesis is only occurring during the growing season and only during the day. So rates of photosynthesis need to be much higher than rates of respiration, which is normally not a problem, but we don't want to give the tree any extra trouble with that. So pruning too much or at the wrong time of the year can be problematic for a tree. It can reduce its rates of photosynthesis. So consider pruning when the tree is dormant to avoid these issues. And in Southern Illinois, this would be around the time of like February or early March, I would say. Um, Number two, don't plant a tree in a poorly drained soil. So unless you know it's adapted for that, trees perform respiration all throughout the tree. So that includes the root system. So they require oxygen to respire. Some trees can handle being in flooded waters for extended periods of time, like bald cypress. But for many, this is a recipe for disaster because it creates an anaerobic condition and can lead to root rot. There needs to be oxygen present in the pores of the soil for the roots to take that up for respiration. So make sure you consider the hydrology of your site when planting trees and what kind of soils your tree is adapted to. Number three, don't fertilize your tree during a drought. So remember, trees take in water through the roots through a process called osmosis. The water moves from an area with less dissolved solids in the water to an area with more. So if you have a lot of fertilizer in the soil and little water in the soil, the tree can't compensate for that. It may not be able to pull water from that soil, so you're making a situation worse if little water is already available. So it would be best to fertilize in the spring when the soils are typically pretty moist. Number four, it's not uncommon, especially like in a lawn situation, for a tree's bark to become damaged. A common kind of damage that occurs is what some arborists or foresters refer to as lawnmower disease. When you drive your lawnmower a little too close to a tree, whether just in your yard or in a plantation, for instance, even just a small bit of contact with the bark can create an opening. The bark of the tree is a lot like our skin. It's the only barrier really keeping foreign material out and protecting from infection. So sometimes roots are also exposed above the soil surface, and we can mow on top of those and cause damage as well. It's really best to avoid this if you want to keep your tree healthy. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of moving parts just inside the bark. We have the inner bark, which carries those sugars created during photosynthesis, the vascular cambium, which builds new inner bark, as well as the xylem or sapwood. Um, and a healthy tree can usually compartmentalize these wounds, but it's best to just avoid damage so the tree does not need to put energy into healing or compartmentalizing when it could be focusing effort more on growing or producing secondary chemicals, which can be used to ward off insects, for instance. And then number 5, if you do damage your tree, don't try to seal it or patch it. When we do this, we are usually making it more difficult for the tree because they have to grow around that foreign material to seal off and compartmentalize that wound. And then I wanted to also provide some more resources because we really just touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to tree physiology. So if you want to learn more, I recommend this text, Physiology of Woody Plants. This is where I've learned a lot of tree physiology information. I'm sure there are a lot of other great texts out there as well, but this will cover all that you want to know and more when it comes to physiology of woody plants. Also, I've included some um, different articles here. So Alex Chigo, that plant pathologist I mentioned, he has multiple articles on coated or that compartmentalization of decay in trees. There's also some great articles from University of Montana on tree growth. And then Oregon State University has a great article here on vegetative plant parts, kind of talking about their functions, maybe in even more detail than I was able to cover here. And then Kansas State University has this article on soil, water, and plant relations, which will get more into the movement of water into the roots and those water potential relations.